I guess that means she's safe.
Then let's go!
Well, thank you, Mr. Adams.
What is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? No, seriously, can anybody tell me? I've pitched this show to people in the past, and it's a struggle to come up with a description. You can try something like this. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a shonen, later seinen, fight manga about members and descendants of the Joestar family. It's a generational story, with each part focusing on a different family member from a different generation. And while that's all more or less true, well... Okay, yeah, maybe that doesn't really begin to prepare someone for JoJo. So then I think, maybe talking about the genre would help. Like I said, it's a fight manga and anime, but it also leans heavily into horror tropes and aesthetics of all kinds. From gothic vampires to Lovecraftian horrors to urban legends, but always with a strong emphasis on body horror and gore. It's also frequently lighthearted, comedic, ridiculous, flamboyant, whatever this is. Everyone aggressively poses at each other. Most things are named after popular English-language Western music. Characters wear elaborate outfits, often inspired by high fashion, and they are wont to spontaneously recite tangentially related fun facts, which may or may not be entirely made up. So then, someone might ask me if I like it ironically, or if it's so bad it's good. And no, JoJo is goofy as hell, and characters can be really frenetic in their behavior, but I think it's really good. I'm genuinely invested in the crazy unfolding story, the fights are as thrilling as they are ridiculous, and there is a hugely infectious quality to everything in it. Sometimes I wonder if I quite understand what I love about this series, what makes the whole thing tick. So that's what I'm here to talk about. The elements that go into making JoJo's Bizarre Adventure what it is. But there is way too much here for me to tackle all at once. The manga has been running since 1987, and each part of JoJo has such a different feel, while still being all recognizably JoJo, that sometimes this feels more like a genre than a series. Moreover, each part builds on the previous one, not always in terms of plot, but always in terms of character archetypes, fighting tropes, story themes, and aesthetic choices. This will be a series of videos, where I track the evolution of these elements through the years and dissect what each part is about along the way. Today we start at the very beginning, as we dive into the story that began it all. The story of two brothers diametrically opposed, but hopelessly bound together. Phantom Blood, and in particular, with its genre. This episode will be a close analysis of the beginning of the story up through the Youth with Dio arc. This is the first 2 volumes of the manga, or the first 3 episodes of the anime, but note that I will talk about spoilers up to the end of part 1, which corresponds to episode 9 of the anime, and chapter 44 of the manga, which is partway through volume 5. This first part of JoJo is often decried as boring, and it certainly is a piece of work that is still in the process of finding itself. My goal here isn't to convince you that part 1 is flawless. It isn't. And although I greatly enjoy it, if you find it too campy or a little tedious, there's a good chance that nothing here will change those particular opinions. Still, just because something is flawed doesn't mean that it's without merit, and there is much here that displays qualities and tropes that Araki would go on to refine for future parts. A surprising amount of the identity of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is already present, in an incomplete form. What I want to do is to highlight those elements so that we can appreciate the growth as we go forward, while never forgetting that this is a story where people breathe sunlight into their fists so they can punch vampires. My name is Luis Valenzuela, and welcome to JoJo's Bizarre Analysis.
Put simply, the theme of this work is living. Through the 2 main characters, I want to examine 2 ways of living. It's all about singing the hymn of the battle between human and non-human. This work was made for your enjoyment. I hope you like it. Hirohiko Araki, author's note for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Volume 1.
Living may be a bit general for a theme, but Araki's quote here points to the way that it's used in the context of Phantom Blood. The story explores what happens when 2 opposing philosophies of living, 2 different ways of living, clash. This being the case, we don't start with our protagonist, but with the circumstances that shaped their early years. Phantom Blood begins with a carriage accident in 1868, where Mary Joestar loses her life. Well, actually, the manga starts with a short scene in the Aztec Empire, where we get introduced to a mask that is activated by human blood, granting the user the ability to drain other people's blood for sustenance, and the carriage accident is then told as a flashback in the next scene. But I like how the anime keeps up the mystery of the exact nature of the mask for longer, by skipping the first scene. Placing the carriage accident front and center is also a nice move, since it is the inciting event of the story. Anyway, as I was saying, Mary Joestar dies, sacrificing her life to shield her infant son from danger. We are treated to the gruesome sight of the carriage driver's death, getting an early start on the series' nearly constant body horror. Mary's husband, George, is injured, but soon recovers consciousness. He first asks the man at his side about his family, and after learning of his wife's fate, he makes sure to thank and reward the man who he supposes to be his rescuer. Mary Joestar's selfless sacrifice and George Joestar's care towards others even at his darkest hour represent one way of living. The other is represented by the man kneeling by George, Dario Brando. Dario had not stopped to help George, as the audience knows, but rather to steal from him. In his haste to rob the injured and dead, he passes over the stone mask, an old artifact purchased by Mary, and he is not concerned with the possibly injured child. In other words, Dario's actions are motivated by superficial self-interest, and he lacks empathy for those around him. These are very straightforward outlooks, clearly created to be simple versions of good and evil. The story then skips ahead 12 years where we meet our protagonist, the son of Mary and George, the young heir of the house, Jonathan Joestar. Though of course, everyone calls him by his nickname.
JoJo!
Jonathan's story is set in 1880s England, and the style of the story tries to evoke the feel of stories from that period. Which is to say, it's not quite set in the real 1880s England, but rather in the literary one, the one that lives in stories. Jonathan is the unambiguous hero, a young scion of a noble house who is not only noble in lineage, but also aims to be noble in character. Our earliest impression of the character is him explicitly stating this ideal of becoming a true gentleman, as he ineffectively fights some bullies, and other characters recognize this nobility in him when they see it. Our pure good hero is opposed by the similarly purely evil villain of the part, Dio Brando. The same age as Jonathan, he is the son of Dario, and is adopted by George upon his father's death. While Dario was casually cruel in his self-interest, Dio's own malice proves immediate and tightly focused. Upon meeting Jonathan, he immediately kicks his dog, a moment as laughably sudden as it is disturbingly violent. Dio then proceeds to wage psychological warfare on Jonathan, upstaging him at home, spreading rumors that he's a snitch to the other kids, and using dirty tactics to injure him while boxing. At every turn, Dio subverts Jonathan's established harmony and turns his life into a living nightmare. He does all this, explicitly, because he believes that Jonathan is weak and that by crushing him, Dio will be able to take everything that Jonathan has. Even before the appearance of any supernatural abilities, this plays out like a Gothic horror. The threat in Gothic horror is generally a supernatural entity that menaces the social order of the protagonist's life, representing, as is common in horror, the anxieties of the authors, who in this case were generally wealthy white Europeans. These authors were often nervous about their world being invaded by those they perceived to be outsiders. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, the titular vampire is a foreign count moving into London and buying property there, evoking the xenophobic anxiety that immigration will lead to erasure of culture. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the main character, Victor Frankenstein, is haunted by new life he created while away at college. All the while, he has a sweetheart back home, which is certainly suggestive. Also, that sweetheart was his cousin, but I think that part is supposed to be normal. Hold on, I just looked it up to see if I remembered Elizabeth being Victor's cousin correctly, and only kind of. This is all the way off topic now, but she was only his cousin in the first edition. I guess it wasn't so normal after all. And then they edited to her being a German orphan from Italy. But that's not the funny part. The funny part is that in both cases, she becomes Victor's adopted sister. Then they grow up and get married. Blood cousins. adopted siblings, romantic couple, Victor and Elizabeth Frankenstein. It's funnily enough a setup I would expect from anime. That's like honestly the funniest thing I've found out all week. Anyway, back to the regular script now. In both cases, there is a monster invading the main character's world, something which upsets the propriety of their social life, as they would see it. Whether that's Dracula's status as an immigrant or Frankenstein's monster's nature as a kind of out-of-wedlock child. Which is not to say that they aren't treated as real monsters in the context of their own stories, psychotic manipulators, they just also represent these improprieties. Horror includes these kinds of themes because they're yet another way that you can unsettle the audience by challenging their comfort zones. Oh, by the way, if describing Frankenstein's monster as an invader or manipulator seems odd to you, you're probably thinking of the unintelligent and mostly innocent creature from the movies, not the eloquent French-speaking psychopath from the books who likes John Milton's poetry and stalks Victor Frankenstein, strangling his little brother to death. Sure, Victor is bad too, creating a brand new creature and abandoning it literally at the first opportunity because he got the spooky Gothic vapors. But the monster isn't an innocent soul who wreaks unintentional harm due to a childlike outlook. I mean, he talks like this.
Slave, I before reasoned with you, but you have proved yourself unworthy of my condescension. Remember that I have power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light of day will be hateful to you. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey.
That's how the monster addresses Victor. Yeah, the movie is not a lot like the book. Anyway, that's the kind of manipulative, dominating Gothic archetype that Dio has created to emulate. The first arc in the manga after the prologue and the first episode of the anime are both called Dio the Invader, and that's how he's portrayed, an interloper in Jonathan's world, a psychopath who seems to have no aims or wants beyond becoming rich and destroying people to get there, whether or not the destroying part is strictly necessary. Like Dracula, Dio is an invader to the Joestar's aristocratic world, not a foreigner, but also not a noble. He is of a lower social class. Like Frankenstein, he is an element from the past that keeps returning. Although notably, unlike Victor Frankenstein, George Joestar had done no wrong to earn this. George's family isn't beset by tragedy due to a moral failing, quite the opposite. It's his kindness which leads to disaster. At first, Jonathan has no answer to Dio at all. He is, stymied by Dio.
Dio! 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 Dio!
Yeah, I think stymied is the right word for this. But he feels powerless to oppose his tormentor, and instead finds comfort in his budding romance with Irina Pendleton, a girl whom Jonathan defended from bullies in his introductory scene. That is, until Dio assaults Irina, enraging Jonathan and spurring him to action. In the ensuing brawl, Jonathan finds the determination to fight through his pain and ends up gaining the upper hand against Dio, before George stops the fight just as Dio was about to take it too far. Of course, while Jonathan's victory here acts as a stopgap against Dio's manipulations, it certainly doesn't end matters. For starters, the damage to Irina's psyche is already done. Having been raised in a rigid noble society, Dio's kiss, despite it being forced, causes her psychological distress too great for her young mind, or Jonathan's, to deal with. This was the intended effect by Dio, and is characteristic of his mode of thinking. Dio generally seeks to subvert people's values, to turn what they hold dear against them. Irina and Jonathan value their nobility, but Dio uses the repressive emotional baggage that comes with that in their society as a knife against them. This is a real flaw in the noble society, and the story vaguely raises the phantoms of other issues, but Dio is not interested in opposing or correcting those societal flaws, he just wants to exploit them. If explored further, that could be really interesting, but I don't want to mislead you. This is treated mainly as something for a hero and villain to clash over, and Irina's character is, unfortunately, just caught in the middle of this with very little story of her own. This tendency of Dio to violate people's principles reaches a horrifying pinnacle later when he turns a mother into a vampire, technically obeying her desperate wish for her child to not be turned, but thereby causing the mother to eat her own child. Yeah, Dio isn't just evil, he is so megalomaniac that he wants his crimes against humanity to have aesthetic symmetry. This ability to pervert things against their own nature, along with his endless charm, are vampiric traits that are present in Dio long before his literal transformation into a bloodsucker. They represent his attempt to exert absolute control. To get even for his loss, Dio kills Danny, Jonathan's beloved dog, in a deeply cruel and gruesome fashion. He ties up the dog's snout so he can't bark and then leaves him in a crate inside a furnace to be incinerated with the trash. While this is obviously a heinous act no matter how you look at it, the anime actually skips over some scenes in the manga that drive the point home even further. You see, in the manga, Danny has a backstory. He and Jonathan were scared upon meeting one another. Danny bit JoJo, and the young Joestar responded by throwing rocks. But despite that rocky start, Danny ended up saving Jonathan's life when the boy nearly drowned in a local river. We are explicitly told that Jonathan doesn't order his dog to do things because he is friends with Danny, that he uses that friendship to deal with the loss of his mother, who also saved his life. And George goes so far as to call Danny a splendid dog who knows the value of life. Now, I get why they cut this. We don't need more reasons for Jonathan being attached to Danny. The boy loves his dog, of course he does, we all get that. But all those things highlight that Danny is a pure symbol of Jonathan's relationship with a mother he never knew. The relationship a core part of Jonathan's psychological well-being, and we know that Dio knows all this because this story is being told to Dio. Dio seems to hear all this and immediately concludes, perfect, then I can just kill the dog, that'll really fuck him up. So, we have a purely good hero opposed by a purely evil villain. A little melodramatic and morally simple? Sure, this story isn't exactly subtle. But despite the setup, which is bathed in these gothic horror tropes, the story isn't actually all that interested in the social themes those tropes were made to comment on. Hirohiko Araki isn't a British noble from the 1880s after all. In fact, most of the elements which tie our main characters to society, including Jonathan's home, some mundane minor characters, and Dio's actual humanity, will all go up in smoke at the end of our first major act. If we did try to interpret Phantom Blood as a story about society, it might seem like the story is upholding the social order and perhaps even condemning George's attempts to help the Brandos out of poverty. However, I think that that's clearly not the case. George's and Jonathan's moral actions are unambiguously depicted as good and just. George helping Dario was disastrous, but it was good. No, instead of being a story about society, Phantom Blood is only really concerned with individuals. And the question that the narrative seems to run with is the following. What happens when we take a purely good protagonist, but one who has always had a fairly easy existence with no true challenges to his way of life, and we have an evil antagonist slowly usurp and take away everything that he holds dear? How does good endure against evil? If doing good can invite evil consequences on oneself, in what way can good win? How far can this struggle be pushed until Jonathan's resolve just breaks? Until this point, Dio has made Jonathan miserable and taken loved ones from him, both temporarily and not. But as we'll see, the story won't be content with just this. The story then skips ahead another 7 years to 1888, but before we get there, I really have to talk about the tone. When I first made my way through JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which I first experienced through the 2012 anime adaptation, I was told that Phantom Blood was boring. But I think that's the wrong word entirely, particularly for this opening bit. Phantom Blood is campy. Shonen anime and manga, and many other genres in the same medium, generally work by portraying action with heightened emotion. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was a big influence in pushing the style even further, and as the series goes on, these extreme emotions and reactions are at such a high that it generally goes right past campy into the truly surreal. That is a large part of the appeal of the series, though by no means all of it, and we shouldn't discount the allure of this weirdness. However, at this early stage, it's really impossible as a reader or viewer to separate the aesthetic sense for the extreme emotions, extreme action and gore, etc., from the general 80s quality of the whole thing. Someone expecting a very psychologically real anime, something like Neon Genesis or Shin Sekai Yori, will undoubtedly find the show too over the top to be relatable. And someone expecting a surreal comedy or action series might find a lot of the elements too standard. That second reaction might very well be simply a consequence of the time that has gone by since Phantom Blood was written. What may have struck an 80s manga reader as wild and imaginative may simply be overshadowed now, often by series that have themselves been heavily inspired by JoJo's. Still, there is a great deal of charm to be found in this part's melodrama and cheesiness, and the next events illustrate just how crazy this part can get. So, Dio spends 7 years pretending to be Jonathan's close friend, essentially gaslighting him about the previous events, and when he comes of age, he begins to slowly poison George, disguising the poison as medicine once the old Joestar falls ill, from the poison still being fed to him by his adoptive son, whom he rescued from crushing poverty. Jonathan discovers this due to a complete coincidence. He finds a letter which Dario wrote to George at the beginning of the story, where Dario describes the symptoms of the disease that killed him. Since Dario's symptoms in the letter are identical to George's in the present, this makes Jonathan realize that Dio murdered his own father and is doing the same to George. When Jonathan confronts Dio over the whole matter, Dio attempts to use his supposed friendship with Jonathan to manipulate him, once again using Jonathan's honor against him. But JoJo turns Dio's trick back on him by asking him to swear innocence on his father's honor, knowing that Dio's pride wouldn't let him do so. After Dio exposes his true nature, Jonathan goes to find the source of the poison, which he tracks to Ogre Street while cosplaying as Sherlock Holmes. How bad is Ogre Street? Cats eat puppies. Walls have faces. That's the level of socioeconomic stagnation we're dealing with. That's the level of crime. Jonathan is surrounded by thugs led by a man whose actual God-given name is Robert E.O. Speedwagon. He beats them all up, but he doesn't greatly injure them because he is a gentleman and is worried about their families. Speedwagon is enchanted by this display of gentlemanlike virtue and immediately becomes loyal to Jonathan forever. Seriously, we never even see the smallest hint of crime around him ever again. Jonathan changes your life, man. Speedwagon calls off the goons and agrees to reveal where Dio got the poison from. Meanwhile, Dio has hatched a plot to kill Jonathan. When the two boys brawled in the mansion as kids, Dio's blood activated the spikes on the stone mask, which protrude in such a way that they would stab into the brain of someone wearing the mask. Jonathan noticed and continued to research it, eventually obtaining a degree in archaeology. But unbeknownst to him, Dio also noticed and remembered the incident, and now has the not at all convoluted plan to use the mask to make Jonathan's death look like a research accident. We never find out exactly how he would do that though, since while considering all this, two passing drunks tease Dio by asking him about his mother. So he casually kills one of them and uses the blood to activate the mask on the second man. This, of course, doesn't kill Dio's victim, rather...
How did this happen? Think, JoJo, think! The knife, father, blood, Dio, the mask, my notes, the brain, unknown abilities, unknown strength! There is nothing human left of you, Dio!
Yeah, that. I'll discuss what that means precisely in my episode on powers, but at the very least it makes him unbelievably strong, while also giving him the ability to drain people's blood to regenerate, at the cost of a fatal weakness to sunlight. Barely surviving the ordeal, Dio makes his way back home having gained valuable information. Though of course, so has Jonathan. I think it's a great touch that all of Jonathan and Dio's major conflicts in this first act of the story take place here at the Joestar Manor. Their boxing match aside, generally the time they spend outside of the manor is spent with them working against one another indirectly, while their direct clashes happen at the house. They are fighting, after all, for all the things that Dio wants to take away completely from Jonathan, and there is no better stand-in for that than the ancestral Joestar residence. It's also appropriate since Gothic horror is also very concerned with location, often having most of the story take place within one large building. After all, the genre is named for its association with Gothic revival architecture, though the Joestar Manor is a Queen Anne style, not Gothic. Regardless, it's here at the manor that Jonathan confronts Dio about his murder plot. Dio cries crocodile tears as he gets ready to kill Jonathan, but Speedwagon is a loyal party member now, apparently never to return to his criminal ways, and with narrator-like certainty, he declares Dio as being absolute evil. This way of speaking, in which a JoJo character comments on the situation at hand with omniscient familiarity and authority, is called by some fans speedwagoning. It will continue to be a thing, so when characters speak with authority on something in a way that seems odd, that's usually more meant to provide the audience with exposition. It's not usually meant to reveal much about the character speaking. Don't think about how they know what they're saying, basically, they just do. It's a convention of the genre that is JoJo's. Speedwagon has brought the Chinese apothecary that Dio got the poison from with them, who, believe you me, I'll come back to in the character episode, and so they have absolute proof of the murder plot. It turns out that George, along with the entire police department, were standing behind a dramatic reveal curtain for all of it, so the entire plan is now out in the open. Dio, of course, does not go quietly and stabs at Jonathan, killing George instead, who jumps into the fray to protect his son. In this moment, the portrait of our two protagonists, as championing opposing ways of living, becomes complete. As George bleeds to death in Jonathan's arms, the police inspector reveals that years ago he caught Dario trying to sell the wedding ring he stole off George at the accident. But George declined to do anything about it and let Dario keep the ring, knowing that Dario had far more need for the wealth than himself. George knew that Dario had not been at the accident to help him long before he took Dio in and raised him as a son. Dio not only kills his adopted father, but also uses George's blood to activate the mask. This figuratively monstrous act is what Dio uses to become a literal monster, before being shot through a window by the police department. Doing great, guys. Excellent reaction time. George has now followed in his late wife's footsteps and sacrificed his life for that of their child. Jonathan, as Speedwagon emphatically pronounces, is the inheritor of this noble Joestar spirit, exemplified by George and Mary's sacrifices. Even though George dies, his spirit is not gone from the world. The good he did lives on in Jonathan. Outside, Dio's transformation has allowed him to survive, and he soon makes short work of the entirety of the police force, who then reanimate as bloodthirsty zombies. Jonathan saves Speedwagon by beating away the zombies, then sets the house on fire before kicking Speedwagon out so he can face Dio. I will go over this fight in more detail a few episodes from now, when I talk about combat in Phantom Blood. But Jonathan suffers burns and broken bones, and he is only able to win in the end by impaling Dio on the statue of the guardian goddess of House Joestar. Dio is caught there and exposed to the fire, but the same fire that allows Jonathan to escape burns away the Joestar household. As I mentioned before, the burning away of the Joestar Manor also seems to burn away the story's connection to its past. Gone is the Joestar Manor. Gone are Jonathan and Dio's place in their social circles. Gone is, well, the entire police department, damn. And the servants are never seen again. They, probably didn't burn to death? No, although the individual elements of Gothic horror, like the existence of vampires, will continue to be a part of the story, from here on out, Phantom Blood pivots hard into a more traditional shonen story structure, with Jonathan facing minion after minion in his journey to defeat the main villain. For although for now Jonathan seems to have ended the nightmare, surviving and even being nursed back to health by Irina, newly returned from years abroad, he is soon confronted by a strange man calling himself Baron Zeppeli, who reveals that Dio and the mask have survived the fight after all. Before Jonathan can really react to this news, the man jabs the injured Jonathan in the chest, stopping his breathing for a few moments, and causing him to crumple to the ground before his arm is suddenly, miraculously healed. But the powers of Phantom Blood are a topic for a different video. Having broken down this first part of the series, I think we have one answer to our question. What is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure? Genre-wise, Phantom Blood specifically starts out as Gothic horror. Our villain, Dio, is a Gothic monster, a vampire in personality and nature even before he puts on the stone mask. Jonathan's resolve to fight against and oppose Dio's evil, even when there seems to be no way to win, is what takes us from the realm of pure horror to the realm of an action fighting series. This pivot doesn't come completely out of nowhere. We get hints of future fights early on when Dio and Jonathan brawl in their childhood, and the story of a hero fighting evil is certainly more at home in a fighting series than in Gothic horror. So, it is perhaps more proper to say that Phantom Blood is a shonen fight series that uses Gothic horror tragedy as its opening act. Still, one of the biggest struggles that Phantom Blood has, to my mind, is in blending its different ideas. The story that I have covered in this video, despite it only being a third of the part, has pretty much all of the character development and character dynamics that occur in the part. Once the fighting starts, there is very little time for further Gothic drama. The two genres seem to float on top of one another like oil on water, It keeps a high energy, somewhat comedic tone all throughout, which does give some consistency to the story, but it never commits that goofiness as much as feature parts would. I would argue that it's not until the end of the part that the two genres of Phantom Blood are truly emulsified into one whole, bigger than the sum of its parts. There's more to talk about before we get to that though, so join me next time as I dive into the power systems present in Phantom Blood, and we see how the themes of the part are present even in the abilities of the main characters. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I don't have a lot of other content yet, but if you're in the mood for something in the anime wheelhouse, I'd suggest checking out the book Cradle. My friend over at the channel Laxia has a non-spoiler review of the first book. Cradle is a cultivation story with heavy shonen fighting tropes, and it's the best example I've seen of something outside of anime trying to fit into that type of genre. Laxia has plenty of great reviews and discussions of books. Go check them out. If you enjoyed what you saw here, please leave a like or comment. It helps a lot. And if you want more of my thoughts on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, as well as other anime, horror, and fantasy series, subscribe. There's a lot more episodes coming of this series, and I'm branching out to more types of videos as well. Check out my Patreon if you're so inclined. You can help choose topics for future videos and get shoutouts in the videos themselves. And it would let me make videos more often and in better quality. Honestly though, if anyone is watching and enjoying this, that alone means a lot to me. Until next time, take care.